All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking some pretty intense systemic economic critiques found in Howard Zinn's historical texts. We're specifically zeroing in on Chapter 11 of his landmark book, A People's History of the United States, appropriately titled Robber Barons and Rebels. Get ready because we are going to look at the fascinating and honestly often hidden architecture of American economic history. To really get where Zinn is coming from, we have to start with this foundational quote from the text. Zinn argues that traditional history basically masks class conflict. He's challenging us to look at the American narrative not as this big, happy, unified family story, but rather through the lens of the marginalized. The texts we're exploring today suggest that the whole pretense of a national interest actually conceals a world fundamentally divided into dominators and the dominated. Here is our roadmap for today based around Zinn's powerful metaphor of the pyramid of wealth. We'll be covering the year of signals, the pyramid of wealth, skillful terracing of labor, the populist party response, and finally, wars and the masterclass. Starting right off with Part 1, the year of signals, 1877. We're starting our chronological journey tracking a direct line from the massive post-Civil War consolidation of wealth in 1877, right into the huge agrarian and labor pushbacks of the 1890s, which ultimately culminated in the political resistance of the early 20th century. It's essentially a massive historical story of action and reaction. So, what exactly were these signals in 1877? Well, according to Zinn's text, this was the exact moment the industrial and political elites consolidated an unprecedented amount of power. The signals were crystal clear. Black progress following the Civil War was going to be rolled back, and the strikes of white workers, absolutely not tolerated. In this historical framework, 1877 marks the exact moment elites decided that the greatest march of economic growth in human history was going to happen strictly at the expense of labor. Moving on to Part 2, the pyramid of wealth. Now, to really picture the very tip of Zinn's pyramid, we can look to supplemental critiques, like George L. Jackson's Blood in My Eye. In texts like Jackson's, we see a searing analysis of how this pyramid is actually maintained. Jackson outlines how a tiny elite utilizes financial institutions, the government, and the military to completely master the system and maintain total control over both the nation's wealth and its narrative. And we are talking about massive, unimaginable fortunes here. Jackson specifically points to families like the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, and Morgans, the true robber barons of the era. He details that this ruling class acted as the literal architects of a centralized monopoly. According to the text, they ruled with iron precision through institutions and media, creating a hierarchy that honestly rivaled any past authoritarian system. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. The sources neutrally describe the intended outcome of all this, and it wasn't an accident. Zinn highlights this quote from a populist manifesto of the era, showing that this economic disparity was deliberately engineered. The goal was to build up colossal fortunes for the top while impoverishing the masses, literally, as the quote says, breeding two distinct classes, paupers and millionaires. Which brings us to Part 3, skillful terracing of labor. So, you might be wondering, how on earth did the 1% stabilize this massive inequality without being completely overthrown by the masses? Well, Zinn introduces this concept called skillful terracing. He defines this as a mechanism where elites deliberately divided up the working class. By rewarding workers differently based on race, sex, national origin, and social class, the system essentially created separate, distinct levels of oppression. It was a highly calculated strategy to keep that pyramid of wealth from toppling over. It was basically a massive divide-and-conquer strategy, and you can see exactly how this compartmentalization worked. The rapid economic growth of the late 19th century was achieved on the backs of these very specific groups. By compartmentalizing black labor, white labor, Chinese labor, European immigrant labor, and female labor, the texts argue that elites effectively pitted different factions against one another to maintain order. Let's zoom in on a specific example of this terracing from the text. Zinn points out that the push to end class exploitation was actively thwarted by offering poor white folks minor social status. This small gift of status was an intentional, historical mechanism meant to prevent the unity of black and white laborers, a unity that the texts identify as being absolutely necessary for any kind of giant rebellion to succeed. Part 4, the populist party response. But look, the folks at the bottom of this pyramid, they didn't just sit there and take it. They pushed back hard. Agrarian rebels in the South and West totally recognized this terracing and exploitation, so they formed the Populist Party. At their 1892 convention in Omaha, they declared fierce opposition to the whole system, stating that the fruits of the toil of millions were being boldly stolen. They viewed the government as an instrument of injustice that solely served the millionaires. And this wasn't some tiny fringe movement either. In 1892, the populist candidate for president, James Weaver, captured over 1 million votes. They literally attempted to link hands, march to the ballot box, and take possession of the government to run it in the interests of the people rather than the robber barons.
So why didn't the whole pyramid come crashing down then? Well, Zinn argues the real genius of the American system is its ability to absorb and deflect rebellion. The system essentially stabilized itself by distributing just enough wealth to create a middle-class buffer. By enlarging the class of small landowners and offering minor concessions, they limited extreme discontent to a minority. This left the basic structure of rich and poor completely intact.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, Wars and the Masterclass. So how did all this internal tension affect things overseas? Returning to Zinn's text, we see a detailed analysis of how foreign expansion served a really convenient dual purpose for the elite. Not only did it open up fresh markets and resources to enrich those robber barons, but it also served as a highly effective mechanism to deflect attention completely away from those domestic class uprisings we just talked about. Eugene V. Debs, a prominent socialist leader at the time, called this out directly. He powerfully pointed out that throughout history, elites, who he calls the master class, declare wars for conquest and plunder. Meanwhile, the working class, the subject class, are the ones who actually bleed and die for them. But as you might guess, the system wasn't exactly thrilled with that kind of talk. For making that exact argument to an audience that included draft-age youths during World War I, Debs was arrested and imprisoned under the Espionage Act. The text we are looking at framed this not as a matter of national security, but rather as the direct, targeted suppression of anti-capitalist, working-class dissent.
And the crazy thing is, these sources argue this isn't just ancient history. Supplemental texts in our analysis, like Michael Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds and Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, argue that this exact same blueprint Zinn outlined is still used globally. They describe a system of free market rapacity that leads to the third worldization of nations, where foreign markets, natural resources, and labor are exploited just to funnel wealth right back to the top of the global pyramid.
Ultimately, what Zinn and these other authors are trying to do is pull back the curtain on a hidden reality, the deflected yet common interest of the 99% against the elite 1%. They assert that reminding everyday people of their capacity to resist is exactly what the establishment would love for everyone to forget. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one big, provocative question straight from the source material. With its skillful terracing, its middle-class buffers, and its massive global reach, will the divided working classes ever actually unite to dismantle this historical pyramid? Can the 99% overcome what Zinn calls the most ingenious system of control in world history? It's a massive question, and it's one the texts leave squarely in our hands to think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the source material. Catch you next time.